there was a particular uh, part within your essays where you talked about how our society may have come to be because of men and male coordination. So I'm going to read a quote out to you, and maybe it says everything that you would need it to say, but it'd be good to hear you unpack it a little bit more. So perhaps you can tell us why it is, in your words, highly likely that patriarchy, coordinated male power, is what made us Homo sapiens. That is, made us the most gracile and only surviving species of the genus Homo. Along with chimpanzees, the pan-troglodytes, we are the equal most proactively, i.e. deliberately aggressive primate. Yet we are the least reactively aggressive primate. The hypothesis is that as we evolved from Homo erectus, teams of beta males able to communicate because we had developed language systematically killed off the alpha males. Because the two forms of aggression use different brain circuits, we used our proactive aggression to systematically select against reactive aggression, murdering our way to niceness. Many, though not all, foraging societies seem to have been quite gender egalitarian, being mobile with fluid groups. They actively suppressed dominance behavior that got in the way of our increasingly cooperative reproduction and subsistence strategies. Such suppression included systematically killing off the alpha males. Why is that important to us today? Why do we need to understand that?
Okay, so this is me rephrasing Richard Brown, who's a very famous Harvard anthropologist, right? So this is his thesis, which I'm just relaying. Why is it important? It's important to realize that teamwork is what made us the way we are. Suppression of dominance behavior was what made us the way we are. And it was male teamwork, by and large. And it was males suppressing dominance behavior by other males. Right. Now, that had a lot of consequences. One is that it became much more important to express emotions, which is why our features are the most gracile of all the genus Homo. We have the most emotionally aggressive, expressive faces, but also the least robust faces, because we're not thumping each other all the time, right? So we have to be able to express emotion, and we don't have to worry about being hit. Now, interestingly enough, of course, Homo sapien women's faces are more gracile than males, which means that they clearly particularly needed to express emotion, but also implies they don't have to be all that robust, which is an interesting thing to think about. But also it's a way, of course, expressing your fertility, which is obviously an issue in this situation, particularly when, children are your pension plan. Yeah, you better breed or else. Anyway, so yes, so that matters because we're looking at how we operate, what makes us the way we are. Now, of course, male teamwork can be positive. It can also be deeply negative. And so that's why the sort of balancing act's going on all the time. And what it also meant is that we generated two other forms of status. We're primates. We worry about status. We're a very status-driven species. If you suppress dominance, you end up with other forms of status. So you end up with prestige. Look at me, I'm clever. Look at me, I took this risk and it paid off, which is one currency of social cooperation. And the other one's propriety. Look at me, I keep to the rules. Look at me, I can be relied on in that way. What's very important about prestige is it's an exploring and discovering form of status. Propriety is much more a safety and conformity form of status. And balancing those two has a big impact on how societies operate. Will Storr argues very, I think, plausibly and correctly, that it was the creating the prestige in discovery which leads to the scientific revolution and the technological takeoff. Overwhelmingly men got prestige from discovering things, from inventing things. So orthodoxies began to unravel under this pressure. Well, the thing is, prestige is disproportionately male because, once again, they're the physically stronger sex who don't have bumps in tow. So they're more able to do the riskier discovery processes. And so, yeah, that's very useful. Women are more disproportionately propriety operated because they're the physically weaker sex with bumps in tow. So they want the rules to protect them. When we look at honor killings, for example, yes, the men usually do the honor killing, but often they're incited by the women because the women want the protection of the norms of their society, particularly in highly patriarchal societies where they're otherwise exposed, right? So propriety and prestige have this tension between them. And what's going on in our society at the moment is a really aggressive imperial form of propriety pushed disproportionately by women is overwhelming prestige. And that's a lot of what's happening, for example, in the decay of science in the universities, where the pressure against not conforming to the gender woo is very strong. And that's an aggressive propriety suppressing a disproportionately female propriety, suppressing a disproportionately male prestige. So there's a whole lot of knock-on effects from this male teamwork suppressing dominance. And if you want a key moment in the cultural history, Shirtgate, that moment where that literally a rocket scientist had supervised the very, very, very clever thing of landing a probe on a comet, which is extremely hard to do, and we never managed to do it before. And he's very happy. He's announced this great achievement. Wow. And he gets shredded online because of his shirt, because it's got semi-naked women on it, right? He's got a Hawaiian shirt with semi-naked women on it, right? Which it turns out had been given to him by a female friend, right? Just to make the moment perfectly ridiculous. But right? So that is a self-righteous propriety, new propriety, because, before then, no one would have ever worried about the fact that his Hawaiian shirt they weren't naked women, they had bikinis on, but there were semi-naked women, right? Okay, no one would have ever cared. It wouldn't have been an issue. Well, maybe back in the 20s with not even the 20s, no, not the 20s, maybe in the 30s they might have cared. Vaguely, possibly in the 50s, maybe, but, not for decades. No one would have cared. And suddenly something for which you crucify the man and he's forced into a tearful apology, right? For something that was no sort of offence 5 minutes earlier. And that's the sort of emblematic thing that's been going on. And that's why, for example, biology's being corrupted, medicine's being corrupted. You have to push the gender woo, otherwise you're a bad person. And there's a whole lot of conformity, which is mobilizing this aggressive reputational destruction through this imperial propriety, which is, very much mobilizing our evolutionary heritage, but in a very negative and corrosive way. And it's creating a really, really, really unbalanced situation where prestige and propriety aren't balanced against each other at all. Prestige is being suppressed in favor of this aggressive, imperial, disproportionately female propriety. Well, the disproportionately male, less disproportionate because of the way our societies have changed, prestige is being suppressed. And of course, going back to Luke Skywalker, what does a hero do? A hero takes risks. A hero does the brave thing that hero does. Yes, he's supposed to keep to the rules in some sense, so there's propriety there, but there's also prestige. And so, yes, so that from suppressing dominance behavior, we shifted to new forms of status, prestige and propriety, one of which is disproportionately male, one of which is disproportionately female. And what we're living in with this feminization of institutions is shaming and shunning going over the top, this imperial aggressive propriety going over the top, and mobilizing our evolutionary heritage in a way that's quite corrosive and destructive.
follow-on question from that. It wasn't my intention to ask this, but it made me think when you were talking about propriety and holding up symbols of the moral caste-based order, as it were, to show that you're on message, so you're not excluded. It reminded me of the former Czech dissident, Václav Havel, who ended up becoming the prime minister and then the president of the country when it was democratically able to do so following the dissolution of the Soviet Union. He wrote in The Power of the Powerless about the parable of the greengrocer, and how there was a greengrocer and he had a Workers of the World Unite sign in the window. And then he goes on to start asking questions. Does he really believe in this statement and everything that it holds? Or is he doing it just to keep the authorities off his back because they're going around checking to see who's on message? But I suppose what struck me, Lorenzo, is the Soviet Union seemed to be dominated by males. And I guess there was a lot of prestige stuff in there. People rose to the top of the ranks by showing they were on message. I know there definitely were women involved in it too. Were women actually quite behind that movement as well, or was this just an example of men's desire for prestige and the kind of aping of that kind of radical egalitarianism in word only, turning into a political system, or was there that kind of push, the female propriety behind it?
Your propriety is not only female, of course. Every priesthood in existence ever pushes propriety very, very strongly. But, and here's a big but, often in alliance with women. Women are a major vector of religious change. And so what you get is a new form of propriety pushed by, in the past, always male or overwhelmingly male priesthoods, but often in a convergence with women. When you look at early Christianity, it's really clear that even though Christianity in some ways reduced the status of women and the legal standing of women, at least compared to what Roman citizen women had, nevertheless, there was this alliance between Christian priests and monks and women. And what did women get out of all that? Well, apart from the promise of salvation, they also got, oddly enough, a feminization of sexuality. Because what does Christianity say? Men aren't allowed to play around either. You have to have sex within a committed relationship, which is, the preferred female option when, sex leads you to getting pregnant. You don't have much control over that. You really, sex within the relationship is, the classic thing that women want. Now, back to your question about the Soviet Union. This was in a situation where organized politics was still overwhelmingly male. So while the communists were very explicit about, for example, women having full fertility rights, right? So, and that in the modern world, control over your own fertility is desperately important to women. So that simply offering that was a big deal. But when you look at the structure of the party, it's a male-dominated party. There aren't a lot of women in senior positions. And that's also true in the Chinese Communist Party, by the way.
Yeah.
It's really striking how male-dominated the Chinese Communist Party is. Even though that's a society, when you look at its social patterns, has become, in certain key ways, very female-dominated. Because the one-child policy led to an excess of men because too many people wanted sons. And, with modern technology, you can get a son if you abort all the daughters. Yes, so that leads to women having the value of scarcity, right? A larger group of men are competing for a smaller group of women, which puts the boot on the female foot in that situation. So when you look at the social dynamics of China, fairly clearly it's, in that sense, a female-dominated society. But when you look at the political structure, very much still male-dominated. So yes, the imperial propriety of communism is not one where this male or female thing operates, but If you go down the society and look at the pattern, then yes, female concepts of propriety are very much driving the interaction between the sexes. So yeah, a man basically has to be able to promise a house before he can get married, right? That's there's a whole structure of expectations there, which are driven by women are in short supply, so they have the advantage of scarcity, right? So, but yes, no, communism is not in any useful sense a female activity. No, that one's a male. You can't blame anyone else but the men for that one.
Okay, that's well. I know as well that time is kicking on there. You're probably going to be wanting to get your dinner on the other side of the world in Australia. I'm wanting to go and get my breakfast. But before we go, Lorenzo, I wanted to trial out a new question that I'm going to ask all of my guests at the end of the show, which is, what have you changed your mind on recently or ever, and what was it that made you think differently?
Okay, so two things I can nominate. One, I used to be very, very in favour of legalisation of narcotics because I really, really hate black markets, and particularly criminal and violent black markets. The way that America has screwed up cannabis legalisation has made me rather more cautious on that matter. The other area where I've very much changed my mind in recent years is I've become much, much more aware of the negative and downsides of migration. Now, part of that is I'm Australian. We basically do migration policy way better than almost anyone else in the Western world. Canada, at least recently, was the only one who was close. We have a much, 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 much higher rate of migration as a percentage of population than UK or United States, Western Europe. And it's nowhere near as politically fraught because we do have border control. And I would point out that that's a case of mobilising public opinion. Because John Howard broke ranks on that and the public were in favour, right? So we've got border control because the Labor Party has learnt that it's got to be in favour of it, otherwise it won't get elected. But because the way we did it was so different from elsewhere, I was not as aware of the downsides that migration could have. Having done a lot more reading and a lot more thinking about how differently it's done elsewhere, I think migration has been a massive bad thing on balance for Western Europe, for the United Kingdom, the United States, because of the way it's been done. It's not necessarily going to be a bad thing, but because of the way it's done, it's become much, much more disruptive and therefore much more politically fraught than it needs to be. And I'm afraid, very simple view is that in the United States, in Britain and Western Europe, migration policy has been used as an elite weapon against the local working class in the way that's just not true in Australia. Partly because we have preferential voting and compulsory voting, and you can't drive the working class away from the polls. So you have to take their view into consideration because they do turn up and vote because they have to. So the ability to screw over the working class becomes much, much less in that situation. Now, there is still one way we do that, which is our mad land use policies, which mean we drive up rents and housing costs through our migration policy, which is the one way we still do screw over our working class. But which also is done in Britain, of course, and also done in Canada, and also done in coastal United States. But the other ways in which you screw up, we don't screw up. And so I've become much, much more aware that migration policy can be done very badly and very destructively. And that's led into, along with my reading into evolutionary means, I've become much less impressed by mainstream economics than I used to be. I have no trouble with markets as such. I have no trouble with commerce as such. I have no trouble with private property as such. So the normal reason why people don't like mainstream economics is they don't like markets, and they don't like commerce, and they don't like private property. I've got no long problem with any of that. My concern is I've presently come to the conclusion it's just not very good science, that it makes assumptions about people that are just clearly not true. And in particular, analysing migration policy as if migrants are just interchangeable widgets is clearly false. I mean, demonstrably false. And of course, this is a problem that economics has in general, treating people as, at some level, optimizing interchangeable widgets when it's clear that culture matters a lot, for example. And the Glenn Lowry principle, which is relations before transactions, that is, economic transactions are embedded in all sorts of connections, cultural assumptions, and so forth, is true. And mainstream economics does not grapple with the truth of the Lowry principle anywhere near enough. So that's three things, actually. One is I'm less impressed by drug legalization than I used to be. Secondly, I'm much more aware of the downsides of migration policy. I would point out that if you read Robert Fogel's Without Consent or Contract, he analyzes how mass migration fractured the American Republic along the fault line of slavery. So the Civil War is about slavery. No argument. If you read the Confederate Constitution, if you read the secession convention debates, it's about slavery. But mass migration, which occurred because we now had railway and steamships, meant that most of the migrants went to the free states, which pushed up their House of Representative numbers, pushed up their electoral numbers, made it more and more likely they'd have more free states. Right. Meanwhile, it also added people, though far less, to the slave states who weren't committed to the slave system because it was disadvantaging them. And what makes Lincoln the break point is the Republican manifesto. It wasn't that Lincoln was anti-slavery. There'd been anti-slavery presidents before Lincoln. He was not the first anti-slavery president. But the Republican manifesto said we're going to have tariffs and we're going to open out the West to homesteading. Well, that's just catnip to the disillusioned, alienated white males, mainly, of the South. And the prospect of an alliance between the slaves and the poor white trash, which Lincoln's election presaged, because he could now appoint Republican organizers to all the federal positions in the South, including the postmasters, who would allow abolition literature to be spread around, and he could mobilize that people to vote. Right? That was an existential threat to the slave system. So the combination of migration and the slavery, the fractured the United States. And you can see that migration is once again putting the US under enormous pressure. The gap between the metropolitan and the provincial areas, which we can also see in Britain, and you can also see in France. That's how to do migration potentially disastrously.
And the third thing was mainstream economics and losing faith in that.
Yeah, and that was connected to all the reading on evolutionary anthropology, but also thinking about this idea about interchangeable widgets. You're analysing migration if you're dealing with interchangeable widgets. That's just rubbish. That's just flatly not true. So for example, there's a thing called the Baumol effect, which is you got increasing productivity here. So the next group round have to bid more for wages. The next group down have to bid more for wages because of the product. So you pull wages up because of the increasing productivity at the top end. So the classic thing is, why are hairdressers paid far more now than they are in 1960? Nothing's changed about hairdressing. It is as productive now as it is in 1960. Well, because productivity at the top end gone up. So you won't get any hairdressers unless you pay them a certain amount. So if you want somebody to cut your hair, you have to pay them. So they're gone up because you pulled up, right? What if you put a whole lot of people of low skills at the bottom end? You suppress the Baumol effect, right? I've never seen an economist talking about migration to think that through. But why did lower end wages suddenly go up during the pandemic?
Yeah. Because
you stopped importing low skilled people. So low skilled, to get the truck drivers, you had to pay them more, right? You had to pay all these people more. This didn't happen in Australia because the way we do our system, we're not having that effect because the point system leads to a situation where, for example, the migrants are on average slightly more educated than the local people. So we're actually pulling up your capital effect, right? I live in a very high migrant area. It's got one of the highest rates of university education in the country. That's not the British experience of migration. That's not the American experience of migration, unless you're in Silicon Valley. It's not the French experience of migration. If you live in a high migrant area, you're not living in a disproportionately high educated area. You're disproportionately the other way around. You're using it as a weapon against your working class.
Yeah. Well, Lorenzo, you've been so generous with your time and your thoughts today.
Absolutely.
It's been one of my favorite conversations. I think your reading lists might be in high demand at some point. And I'm certainly going to keep close to your work. I'd love to stay in touch. I'd love to have more conversations in the future. I think it's very important that people are able to try and analyze these things. And, there seems to be no substitute for a kind of a depth of reading across subjects. I mean, you have effectively encapsulated the benefits of trying to be a self-taught polymath in some way, because it allows you to get out of silos and not just focus on things in just a single-minded, ideological, or in a certain field's perspective. So I thank you for it, and I hope everyone goes and checks out your Substack. Lorenzo, just before you go, where can people find you? What are the various handles on social media and Substack?
Right. So Lorenzo from Oz. So I think on Twitter I'm Lorenzo from, I think. But Lorenzo from Oz is my Substack. But I also write on Helen Dale's Substack, which is not on your team.
Yeah.
Not on your team. Yes.
Yeah.
That's her Substack. So
great.
Not on your team.
Okay. And when can we expect the book that you referenced in the podcast?
Well, the marriage book is going to take quite a while.
Okay.
The Worshipping the Future book, although the essay list keeps getting longer, I am getting towards the end of it. So when I've finished writing those essays, it will be, we will start shopping for a publisher. Okay,
great. Well, we'll keep an eye out for it. In the meantime, keep fighting the good fight, and we'll speak again in the future. Take care, Lorenzo.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Date with all that I am doing, please subscribe to the Thinking Class YouTube channel at Thinking Class and follow me on X at Thinking Classes. Thinking Class seeks to understand the civilizational issues we face and why what our leaders do in response matters. Here, I seek to explore the ideas, values, and culture that made our civilization, those that are unmaking it, and how leaders at our public and private institutions should respond. Engage with me on YouTube or X, or write to me at thinkingclasspod@gmail.com to tell me who you want me to speak to and what topics are important to you. I look forward to seeing you there and for joining me on this journey.